I'm going to not ask the traditional question, can you hear me in the back? That's the wrong question. If you cannot hear me in the back, you couldn't answer it. I'm going to ask instead, if you can hear me in the back, please raise your hand. Thank you very much. I'd like now to introduce Elio Frattaroli. Elio is a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst. I regard him as a good friend, even though he's in Philadelphia, and we're quite apart, and we don't see each other that often. We have a common friend in mind, Howard Kovitz, and we've been on a couple of panels together and sparred a couple of rounds, and he's got a couple of knockout punches, and I hope he'll spare us none of his sharp jabs and right crosses this morning. He's a member of the American Psychoanalytic Association. He's in full-time private practice, doing psychoanalysis and psychotherapy with adults, adolescents, and couples. He's on the faculty of the Psychoanalytic Center of Philadelphia, and he's the associate director of their psychodynamic psychotherapy training program, as well as acting as an assistant clinical professor of psychiatry at the University of Pennsylvania.
That's a pretty old bio.
However, he studied Shakespeare at Harvard and subsequently trained with Bruno Bettelheim at the University of Chicago's Orthogenic School before turning to medicine. He's written and lectured on Shakespeare as well as on psychiatry and psychoanalysis. He lives and practices in Bala-Cynwyd. Did I say it right?
Bala-Cynwyd.
Bala-Cynwyd. He's the author of Healing the Soul in the Age of the Brain, Becoming Conscious in an Unconscious World. I give you my very erudite friend, Elio Frattaroli.
I almost said no to the invitation to speak here today because I had a subtle uneasy feeling about the way the conference was organized. I was told that the topic would be brain, mind, and body. Sorry. Okay? Better? Did you hear me so far? Yeah, okay. I was told that the topic would be brain, mind, and body with a panel on each one. I was also told there would be an introductory keynote address given by a neuroscientist friendly to psychoanalysis on the topic, How Brain Shapes Mind. And I was told that panelists would then have 25 minutes each to present clinical material illustrating how we conceptualize brain, panel 1, mind, panel 2, or body, panel 3. I wasn't sure at first why this description of the conference made me uneasy, so I did what I always do with patients when I get subtle, disturbing feelings that I don't understand. I start from the assumption that my feeling is valid. The conscious manifestation of an instinctive adaptive response to a communication that contains important information about the meaning of the communication. When my feeling is ambiguous and unsettling, I take it as a signal of an ambiguity in the communication, an inconsistency or conflict between the words and the music, the intended semantic meaning and some unintended unconscious affective meaning. I then extract and unpack from my feelings this information about conflicted meanings using a process of close introspective attention that involves 4 steps. First, I discern the conscious qualities that allow me to identify and name my feelings. Second, I reflect on these feeling qualities until I can recognize exactly what they're about. In other words, exactly which elements of meaning in the communication evoked these particular feeling qualities. Third, I consider, how are my feelings disposing me to react to these particular meanings? In other words, what do I feel like doing or saying about the meanings I'm reacting to? And in reacting this way, what kinds of motives, intentions, attitudes, and agendas am I implicitly attributing to the other person? And also, what is it in my personality that tends to react in just this way to just these meanings? Fourth, I ask myself whether my reactions, my attributions about the other person, and my personality tendencies in this particular situation feel good or bad, right or wrong, and whether there's an alternative way of understanding and responding to the situation that might feel better. I then use this information about myself and the other person that I've unpacked from my feelings to address the task or problem at hand, which in psychoanalysis is to facilitate the patient's internally generated process of becoming conscious, and right now is to present you with some clinical material that illustrates the way I think about mind. So when I introspected in this way on my subtle, uneasy feeling about this conference and asked myself precisely what was the feeling about that made me want to say no to the invitation, I noticed that my feeling and my impulse to say no were in response to three interrelated problems. Problem one, there was no organizing theme to the conference, no apparent attempt to connect and integrate what the three panels would be discussing, or to relate their discussions to the topic of the keynote address. Without such an organizing theme, it felt like I would be preparing my talk in a little rowboat, alone and adrift at sea, knowing that other presenters in their rowboats were floating somewhere just over the horizon, but with no radio signal or lighthouse beam to guide us toward a meeting of the minds. Problem two, the expectation that I should parse my clinical material so as to illustrate specifically how I conceptualize the mind as distinct from the brain and the body felt weird, unnatural, incompatible with the way I actually think and work. It felt something like being expected to describe a forest, i.e. the intersubjectivity of a clinical encounter, in a way that illustrates how I conceptualize tree trunks, i.e. mind, as distinct from roots and soil, i.e. brain and body, but without ever mentioning the leaves, spirit, or the tree as a whole, the existential self or soul. Problem three, I was suspicious about the implicit, perhaps unconscious agenda reflected in the decision to have the keynote address and the first panel focused on the brain. This decision seemed inconsistent with the stated expectation that the focus of the panel should be clinical. I was concerned that it would set a detached, third-person neuroscientific tone for the conference that could detract from what to me is the essence of good clinical material, namely, first-person descriptions of the experiential immediacy of the intersubjective encounter. Well, that's my first-person description of the experiential immediacy of my intersubjective encounter with today's conference agenda. And I'm counting it as clinical material because I recognize those three problems that made me uneasy about our agenda as a 21st century symptom of Freud's 19th century mishigas. His neurotically conflicted devotions to two mutually exclusive life agendas. On the one hand, to be true to the scientific Weltanschauung of his age by trying to reduce the wholeness of human experience to the quasi-neurological terms of his so-called metapsychology, and on the other hand, to be true to himself and to his calling as a healer by developing a clinical methodology that depends on self-reflective consciousness, on the capacity to discern and discriminate meanings, values, and moral categories, and on the possibility of free will, all of which are activities of the soul for which no neurologic explanation is even remotely imaginable. Well, come to think about it, these activities of the soul do suggest a level of mind that is distinct from brain and body. I'll call it spirit mind. But in practice, I think of self-reflective consciousness, moral discernment, and free will as integrative activities involving all four agencies, body, brain, mind, and spirit, working together to process information that we get from affect, emotion, and feeling. For example, in the act of recognizing and paying attention to my uneasy feeling about the conference agenda, I became conscious of what had begun in the darkness as a completely unconscious affect, then came into my lower level experiencing consciousness as a black and white reactive emotion, an impulse to say no, and finally emerged under the clear light of my introspective attention into a discriminating, self-reflective awareness of articulable feeling. In the process of then putting these feelings into words, I was able to recognize, discern, and evaluate specifically what it was about the agenda and about me that made me want to say no, which then opened up the possibility of choosing to say yes if I could find a way to combine the conference agenda with my own agenda without disrespecting the wishes and aims of the conference planners. So, putting this in terms of mind, I think of affect, emotion, and feeling as three levels of human experience through which the mind registers, responds to, and recognizes meaning. Affect I think of as an event happening in the brain and body and affecting the mind from outside, from the darkness of the unconscious. Neurobiologically, affect is a reflexive, visceral response to a sensory stimulus, only not to the sensory stimulus per se, but rather to the meanings that are carried by the stimulus. In this case, the incomplete and inconsistent meanings to which I felt myself reacting when I heard about the agenda for the conference. This idea that affect is a response to meanings is consistent with lots of research that shows that unconscious affects are involved in appraisal, unconscious appraisal, and decision making. So a lot of information gets processed at an unconscious level through affect and leads to adaptive responses. Emotion I think of as motivated passive experience. Passive, passion, same root. Motivated passive experiencing, happening in the gray blur of ordinary moment-to-moment, unreflective consciousness. Emotion, from the Latin ex movere, to move out, is an experience of affect becoming conscious, a visceral impulse moving us outward into action as a conscious need, urge, or desire to react to a meaningful stimulus by doing or saying something about it. In this case, my uneasy impulse to say no the moment I heard about the conference agenda. And then feeling I think of as a quiet, centered awareness happening in the light of a higher self-reflective consciousness. In feeling, the visceral turmoil of emotion becomes conscious as a distilled quality of awareness that contains detailed information about the meaning, value, and moral valence of whatever our emotion is about and whatever it's impelling us to do. Our feeling tells us exactly what the meaningful stimulus actually means to us, that impels us to react to it the way we're reacting, and also what objective meaning it might have to which anyone would react in just the same way. In that sense, and this is important, feeling is a way of knowing. As in this case, where it is only through reflecting on my uneasy feeling that I came to know about problems with the incomplete and inconsistent conceptual organization of this conference, and was able to recognize that these are not just my own idiosyncratic problems, but are symptom of a deeper problem in the incomplete and inconsistent conceptual framework of psychoanalysis generally, an incompleteness and inconsistency that are the legacy of Freud's unresolved Oedipal conflict with his neuroscientific fathers. Do you feel me? I had to ask. So anyway, I'm glad you got that. So anyway, having recognized this incompleteness and inconsistency, I thought I could suggest an organizing theme and conceptual framework myself by integrating brain, mind, and body under the aegis of a fourth dimension of human nature that's missing from the conference agenda, just as it was missing from Freud's metapsychology, namely the dimension of self-reflective moral consciousness that I'm calling spirit mind. With the addition of this fourth dimension, Freud's Oedipal conflict pretty much resolves itself. His metapsychology gains the meta-consciousness it needs to become consistent with his clinical method and to explain what actually happens in the psychoanalytic process. As I understand it, the psychoanalytic process is simply a process of getting fully in touch with feelings that entails two levels of becoming conscious. First, emotion becoming conscious reflexively, impelled by affect. Second, feeling becoming conscious reflectively, through higher level introspective attention to the conscious qualities of lower level unreflective emotion. In the first becoming conscious, a brain-mind emerges passively out of body and brain. In the second becoming conscious, a soul or self emerges out of body, brain, and brain-mind through the active, self-reflective agency of a meta-level spirit mind. This spirit mind is the self-transcending agency that Robert Velder attributed to the superego, and that does fit the literal meaning of Freud's Das Über-Ich, the I that stands above. So getting in touch with feelings, becoming conscious of becoming conscious, is a two-stage transformation of unconscious affect, first into unreflective emotion and then into self-reflective feeling. In this process, an embodied brain becomes a personal self, and it becomes an I through the self-reflective agency of an I that stands above. To further delineate this process, the first stage transformation of unconscious affect in the embodied brain into conscious emotion in the brain-mind moves us in two conflicting directions, toward outward reaction and toward inward reflection. Intersubjectively, the instinctive reactivity of brain-mind's emotion generates repetitive transference, countertransference enactments, while intrapsychically, these emotions also have feeling qualities that, in the light of spirit-mind self-reflective attention, signal to us what our emotions are about and what they mean. So in terms of how I think about mind clinically, I would say, when I listen to patients, I'm listening with my evenly hovering spirit mind to what my embodied brain mind is telling me about them, so that I can use this information to talk to their spirit mind, the patient's spirit mind, about what his or her embodied brain mind is trying to tell both of us. In general, as we allow and accept into our morally discerning spirit mind's awareness the fully articulated feeling of what our amoral, impulsive brain mind is unreflectively urging us to do, and why we actually feel like doing it, these newly discovered feelings gradually connect us with the deepest disowned, alienated parts of ourselves, making us whole, healing our unconscious divided souls, and gradually nudging us toward a more compassionate acceptance of ourselves and each other. It is this self-actualizing, humanizing process that I believe Freud had unconsciously in mind when he wrote, "Wo es war, soll ich werden," where it was, shall I become. By it, Freud meant a state of being passively lived like a puppet by the unconsciously generated reactions of der seelischen Apparat, the apparatus of the soul, i.e. brain-mind. As described in Freud's impenetrable project and his inscrutable chapter 7, this brain-mind is a glorified neurological reflex designed to receive sensory and visceral inputs, process them unconsciously according to the constancy or nirvana principle, and then output behavioral or emotional discharges aimed at maintaining neurological homeostasis. This reflex apparatus of the soul was the framework of Freud's original metapsychology, which is really a pre-psychology or infra-psychology in that it defines hypothetical lower-order events that support psychological experience from below rather than higher-order concepts that explain psychological experience from above. Which is why until 1918, Freud wrote as if he believed that the maintenance of lower-order, unreflective, pre-psychological homeostasis was the only purpose of human life. By 1933, however, when he wrote, "Where it was, shall I become," Freud had developed a new, legitimately meta-psychology, modeled on Plato's and Aristotle's tripartite soul, the it, the I, and the I that stands above. And by that time, he had obviously recognized that the soul needs something more than what the soul's apparatus is designed to provide. Specifically, like Pinocchio, the soul needs its instinctive, amoral, deterministic it consciousness to become a morally discerning, intentional I consciousness. The soul's body, brain, and brain-mind need the compassionate attention of its spirit mind to become a dynamic, individuating human self. This existential self or soul is an ineffable combination of human being and human becoming. The brain-mind seeking unreflective homeostasis through repetitive enactment, while the spirit-mind seeks self-reflective awareness, knowledge, and acceptance of self and other. In this ongoing dialectic of being and becoming, brain-mind and spirit-mind, the soul repeatedly becomes conscious of becoming conscious, alternately enacting and becoming aware of its bondage to the compulsive pursuit of narcissistic, homeostatic, tension-reducing comfort, pleasure, self-cohesion, and safety, while alternatively forgetting and then rediscovering the more enlivening and humanizing possibilities of curiosity, mentalization, creativity, community, love, compassion, moral discernment, and free moral choice. So Freud was right about the brain-mind's need for homeostasis, the safety of sameness, which is manifest in the human personality's function of maintaining stability and identity, and in the everyday psychoanalytic experience of resistance and negative therapeutic reaction. But this need of the brain-mind for homeostasis is in perpetual conflict with the soul's need for change, growth, self-actualization, and moral integrity. So the point of Freud's aphorism is that through the repetitive clash of these conflicting needs and the power of compassionate, self-reflective psychoanalytic attention, becoming conscious of becoming conscious, a remarkable transformation can occur, and it can become an I. Our inner Pinocchio can become a real boy. Well, that sounds pretty good. But how can I claim to know that's what Freud was unconsciously trying to say, or that it's an accurate description of the psychoanalytic process, which, especially when psychoanalysts have never been able to agree on just what that process entails? Well, for one thing, when I talk about the soul and its self-reflective moral consciousness, spirit mind discerning and evaluate the meaning of brain mind's unreflective experiencing, I'm using concepts that are considered unscientific and are foreign to psychoanalysis. But they're necessary to explain how healing actually happens in and between the first-person consciousness of the analyst and the analysand. Psychoanalysts have traditionally had contempt for such unscientific concepts. When we hear the words spirit and soul, we reflexively wince, as if they were shameful, dirty words, suggesting a weakness or flaccidity of mind, a kind of New Age neurasthenia. I myself winced every time I wrote the word soul during the first 2 years of writing my book, Healing the Soul in the Age of the Brain, Becoming Conscious in an Unconscious World. I got over it. Our contempt and shame, over these words, yeah, it's not going to happen. Our contempt and shame over these words are the products of an institutionalized archaic superego, a Lamarckian inheritance of Freud's contemptuous reaction formation against his own shamefully unscientific fascination with mysticism, philosophy, and religion. Even the concept of mind is problematic for us. Starting with Freud, psychoanalysts have referred to the mind only in terms of third-person mental functions, mental agencies, and mental contents, because these are scientifically kosher. We never talk about the mind as consciousness, mind as the first-person self-aware experiencer of our conscious experiencing, or as the first-person knower of what our experiencing means, because this kind of talk feels completely unscientific. Well, it is unscientific, but that's only because science is so profoundly limited that it has no method for actually observing consciousness. Even the consciousness Antonio Damasio writes about, for example, is not a neurological process he observes scientifically in a brain or a PET scan. It's a private inner experience he observes self-reflectively, an experience of the unreflective lower-level consciousness of brain-mind, which he calls core consciousness and autobiographical consciousness. He's able to talk about this lower-level consciousness scientifically only insofar as he can discuss it in terms of its third-person neurological correlates. But he has no way to talk about the first-person autobiographer's consciousness, the consciousness of spirit mind, because it has no observable neurological correlates. Yet the self-reflection of this autobiographer's consciousness is the only method Damasio could have used to observe the lower-level autobiographical and core consciousness he describes, a consciousness he observed not as a measurable neurological process, but as a conscious awareness of what he calls the feeling of what happens. The point being that I know about the psychoanalytic process the same way Damasio knows about core consciousness. I know it because I can feel it. And I would argue that the only valid way to know anything about the mind is by feeling it. I realize many experts believe the only valid way to know about the mind is by researching the brain, but the truth is just the opposite. Like Damasio, all brain researchers need to have self-reflective knowledge about the mind first, or they would never know the meaning of anything that they're observing in the brain. And this self-reflective knowledge is precisely the kind of knowledge on which psychoanalysis is based, the knowledge of self and other that we get through discerning the meaning of our own feelings. So if psychoanalysis is to have any future at all, I believe it is imperative that we recognize, understand, and assert the irreplaceable value and irreducible validity of this kind of knowledge. The fact is, there are two kinds of valid knowledge: research-based knowledge about the physical world that can be seen and measured, and feeling-based knowledge about the invisible, unmeasurable inner world of consciousness. Research-based knowledge tells us how things work. Feeling-based knowledge tells us what things mean. Without feelings, we would have no way of knowing what anything means, including the findings of scientific research. There's no purely cognitive, logical, thought-based knowledge of meaning, because the only way to distinguish logic from illogic is to feel it, as in, feels right, or, feels wrong. These feelings, by the way, are what I call recognition feelings. They're the signal version of an epiphany or shock of recognition. They happen so often and so subtly that we rarely notice them, but it turns out they're essential to all human knowledge. Without them, neuroscientists couldn't distinguish an axon from a dendrite, and none of us could know the meaning of anything we're hearing today, or how to cross the street safely on our way home. And I would clearly have no idea what I'm talking about when I claim to know what Freud unconsciously meant by wo es war, soll ich werden. And yet I do know what he meant, because I can recognize by feeling it that his aphorism accurately describes my own experience as an analysand. A turning point in that experience happened one day when I was in a state of agitated anxiety about a case I was scheduled to present. There was so much neurophysiological noise in my anxiety that I couldn't discern in it anything specific that I felt anxious about. So I simply let myself feel the roiling emotion, and before long, I was surprised by the sudden appearance of a particularly vivid fantasy. I became aware of it first as a compelling impulse to do something in response to a recent disturbing encounter with colleagues that I had forgotten until that moment. This impulse then developed quickly into a more elaborated fantasy with a compelling storyline that felt like it had something universal about it. In fact, years later, I had a dream that compressed this whole storyline, Wolfman-like, into a single archetypal visual image. But at the time, what impressed me was that this was a kind of fantasy I'd never had before, and it suggested I'd been much more disturbed by the encounter that provoked the fantasy than I had realized until the moment I began fantasizing about it. It took me years to understand what my new fantasy had to do with the agitated anxiety that had given rise to it, but over time I came to recognize a complex of specific, previously unconscious emotions that were expressed in the fantasy and that I had good reason to be anxious about. I had known about these emotions in the abstract for many years, in the form of a personality pattern that a fair number of people had noticed and felt called upon to describe to me as a kind of assholic arrogance. Know thyself, right? But prior to becoming conscious of the feelings embodied in my fantasy, I'd never recognized this arrogance in myself. That's the truth. Much less felt any moral responsibility for its impact on other people. Kind of like Oedipus, not recognizing his own hubris or feeling any moral compunctions about having killed that jerk who tried to run him off the road until he discovered that the jerk was his father. Similarly, I didn't fully recognize my arrogance or feel conscious moral anxiety about it until I became aware that I was inflicting it on my analyst. I first noticed the subtle tone of arrogant dismissiveness in my response to one of his interpretations, and then had a shock of recognition and remorse as I realized I'd been arrogantly dismissing all his interpretations in just the same way for many years. Over time, this allowed me to understand the intermittent bouts of anxiety about public speaking I had experienced since childhood, adolescence, which was one of the main reasons I was in analysis. They always involved an impulse to dismissively attack an idea, theory, or ideology that felt destructive to something I cared about. Confronted with such a threatening idea, I tend to lapse into a tone of polemical, self-important, hypocritically self-righteous, arrogant dismissiveness, oblivious to the fact that many of the people I'm speaking to might care deeply about the very idea I'm dismissing. To me, their offensive idea feels just like a big fancy guy in a chariot trying to run me off the road. So my arrogant Oedipal impulse is to attack the idea because it's attacking my ideas. My urgent anxiety about this impulse, then, is the voice of my higher moral consciousness, reminding me to treat others as I would have them treat me, and trying to transform my dehumanizing, demonizing discharge of polemical energy into a humanizing communication of the ideas I care about that could actually lead to a meaningful conversation. Interestingly, one idea I had dismissed throughout my analysis, an idea I was sure I would never agree with, was the universality of the Oedipus complex. So after rediscovering this universality and beginning to resolve the conflict through my own psychoanalytic process, which is clearly a work still in progress, I happened to reread Strachey's translation and realized suddenly how different Freud's aphorism sounded when translated accurately. Where it was, shall I become. Wow, I thought. Well, that's exactly what's happening to me as I'm becoming less of an arrogant prick and more of a mensch. Oh, so that's what he meant. Say the last thing again. Right, less of an arrogant prick and more of a mensch? Oh, so that's what he meant. Okay, that's it.